Forces disabled an Iranian-flagged oil tanker, the MT Hasna, in the Gulf of Oman on May 6 after it ignored repeated warnings to stop violating a U.S. blockade on Iranian ports. According to U.S. Central Command, an FA-18 fighter jet from the USS Abraham Lincoln fired its cannon to damage the vessel's rudder, forcing it to halt. The tanker was not carrying cargo at the time. The incident is part of ongoing enforcement actions, with more than 50 vessels blocked or redirected in recent weeks. U.S. forces have used similar disabling measures in prior blockade enforcement operations. President Trump warned Iran it could face intensified U.S. bombing if it fails to finalize a potential agreement to end the ongoing conflict. His comments came amid diplomatic efforts involving Pakistan and China, with signs of progress prompting a temporary pause in the U.S. naval escort mission in the Strait of Hormuz. The broader U.S. blockade of Iranian ports remains in place. Iran has demanded a fair agreement while maintaining pressure on shipping in the strait. Markets reacted positively to hopes of de-escalation, with oil prices falling and stocks rising, though analysts caution that negotiations remain fragile and could quickly reverse. Iran has introduced a new system to regulate maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, requiring ships to follow rules issued by a newly created authority to obtain transit permits. Iran has restricted access to certain Western-linked vessels, while draft legislation may impose fees or bans. The disruption of the strait, an essential global oil route, has pushed energy prices higher and raised concerns about potential shortages. China has moved to block U.S. sanctions targeting several independent Chinese oil refineries accused of importing Iranian oil, signaling a stronger response to American economic pressure. The action follows new regulations allowing Beijing to counter foreign sanctions and could lead to penalties against entities complying with U.S. measures. The dispute is tied to the broader conflict over Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, where shipping disruptions have reduced global traffic but allowed Iranian oil exports to China to continue through alternative routes. Analysts say China's decision may accelerate the development of alternative financial systems and trade networks independent of U.S. influence. Nigel Farage's Reform UK party is leading national opinion polls ahead of local elections, signaling a potential breakthrough in British politics.
It's not the party of Alarm Clock Wales or Alarm Clock Britain. It's the party of those who would rather not get up in the morning and live off the taxes paid by everybody else, who in many cases are working longer hours and harder and being taxed more than at any point in their lives. This is not a Labour Party, it's a welfare party.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a $10 billion fuel security package aimed at strengthening domestic energy resilience amid rising fuel prices linked to the Iran conflict. The plan includes establishing a government-owned fuel reserve of 1 billion litres and expanding stockholding requirements to ensure at least 50 days of supply, though this remains below international benchmarks. Additional funding will support fuel imports, storage, and potential new refining capacity. The initiative responds to decades of declining domestic refining infrastructure and heavy reliance on overseas supply chains, with the government seeking to bolster long-term energy security.
This support from the government will not be business as usual. It has to be additional supplies that are available on the international market, and it literally will be underwriting the purchase of shiploads of fuel to get here to Australia. While Australia's fuel supply outlook remains secure in the near term because of the actions that the government has taken, let's be clear that the longer this war goes on, the more the impacts will be.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today. Now the protagonists.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome to the Protagonist on this Thursday morning in the UK, Thursday in the US, Thursday here in Australia. I won't tell you what year it is here, but looking at some of the headlines around Australia has been terrible with our government. Anyway, that's another protagonist. The adage, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, and expecting different results could be applied to our central banks, and they could be. This week, the Reserve Bank of Australia, hello, my teleprompter stopped. Reserve Bank of Australia, whose objective is to promote the economic prosperity and welfare of the Australian people, tipped many into financial stress by raising interest rates for the third consecutive time. That's to put a big brake on rising inflation. We all know that the war in Iran, kicked off by the universal king Donald Trump, had nothing to do with most of us, but it will supercharge inflation, which was already lurking and not so quietly, just hiding behind that wad of money. And so we are warned sagely by the governor, we face dark days ahead. We have those dark days that are coming towards us. It's very scary, and yet they are causing it. Why is it that after decades of low or no official inflation and low interest rates, we are no better off? We've seen low economic growth, astronomical increases in house prices, which banks have rushed to fund at low risk, and a huge blowout in public and private debt. Should most of us acknowledge that our governments, the central banks, and of course the financial institutions have been wrong all along? I wonder. And just finally, it amazes me at what government is doing at the moment in this country. Is prosperity for nation states and the bulk of the population quite achievable if our banks start lending maybe for productive investment? Can we have more competition in banking and more rather than less smaller banks? It would be a big change, and would we be worse off with a complete turning of the tide? We have some great economists here to shed some light on these questions. What are our chances? Can we realistically choose prosperity over poverty? Big question. What are our chances? And one final thought. The very power central banks exercise to set the cost of credit, to determine the rate of unemployment, to redistribute income and wealth, is the most profoundly political power an economic institution can wield. Think about this. Yet it is exercised by technocrats or bureaucrats beyond democratic control. Our panel today, old regulars, not so old, but regulars anyway. Vicky Price is the economic advisor and board member for Centre for Economics and Business Research. Martin North, great to have him back again too, Principal of Digital Finance Analytics. Catherine McBride, OBE, a free market economist. First of all, I'd like to say a big hello and thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Hello.
Good
Morning.
hello.
Or good evening.
Well,
Good evening to you.
It's early evening, so it's still before Scotch o'clock, you see. Vicky, can I just ask you just quickly your thoughts on, because many people say that the banking industry is corrupt. Is that rightly so, or maybe it's a slight exaggeration?
Well, it depends, of course, whether we're talking about sort of normal retail banks or whether we're talking about the financial sector more generally. But there is no doubt that a number of the banks have been fined for money laundering, for example. We've seen them across the continent. We've seen that concern happen even in the UK. There is an issue as to whether, despite all the increases we've seen in regulation of banks since the financial crisis, there's quite a lot that goes on, which is perhaps sort of not acceptable. And we've also seen across the board a number of scandals, such as overcharging consumers for various things. Right now in the UK, we have a problem with car finance, where the banks have to return money to people who were charged a little bit more in terms of the interest rates that they should have been paying. by when they were leasing cars. So it happens sort of almost on a sort of constant basis that there is something that we find that is wrong in the banking system. But it does not mean that the banks are not serving us reasonably well. I mean, if a strong financial sector is an absolute must in terms of making sure the economy works. And we saw what happens when you have completely deregulated, well, considerably deregulated or lost control of regulation at the last financial crisis. And now, of course, there is a lot more compliance that needs to be followed and a lot more control by the regulatory authorities of what the banking sector does. But there is another element of it. There is a huge amount that's been going on in terms of private credit, hedge funds, equity bodies, asset management institutions. They are all involved in doing a considerable amount of what the banks used to do, which is lend to companies, particularly startups, but also down the line as well. And what the concern now is that they're perhaps doing it in a way which is evading, if you like, some of the regulations that could have been, or avoiding, shall I say, that could have been imposed if there were proper banks. And there is concern that some of that lending that's happening right now is not based on very solid ground. So that's where the next possible concern is, which various central banks have already started expressing.
Martin Moore, thank you for joining us. Can you tell me your thoughts, please?
Yeah, so the financial system is not working for ordinary Australians or other people around the world and ordinary businesses. It's designed to protect the trading system that we've got and the financial profits that the large corporates are making, and also the speculative investments that many investment banks are making at the moment. The second point, of course, is that the interest rate lever, which the Reserve Bank and other central banks use, is a very blunt instrument. It is not very effective, and they've been ineffective at trying to even get the basic inflation point to where it needs to be. It's hard to do, and things keep changing. The third point is that the so-called independence of central banks are, I think, already in question. If you look at how they are politically aligned quite often, if you look at how they support the status quo. And if you take all of those back and just think about it, my point is this: the future can change. You can do things differently. If you don't, we're going to go round and round this sweep cycle, which means that ordinary people go backward. They lose more and more of their income in real terms. Big corporates benefit. The large financial system benefits. And by the way, the government can borrow more and more, and nobody seems to care. We need to change it.
And Catherine McBride, great to see you again. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think people are conflating banks. Everyone likes to call the banks or one big thing, but they're not one big thing. So you've got sort of high street banks, if you like, who will lend you money for a mortgage or lend money to a local business. But you've also got investment banks, and you've also got finance companies. So Vicky talked about the car thing. That was finance companies generally. And quite frankly, a lot of the regulation the banks in the UK have to put up with are stifling their ability to do other things. So they stay pretty close to their lane, and they still get caught because we've tried to regulate for risk so that people expect to get their money back if they make a mistake. So if they didn't read the fine print and discover the guy who was selling them the car finance was actually taking a cut of that finance, which is how banks work. Every middleman takes a piece of the action, and yet people were upset about that because they didn't read the fine print. It would have been written down, but they didn't read it, so then they get their money back. And unfortunately, we have governments, and it's not just this one, it's been a sequence of governments who somehow or rather feel that all people should be protected against all risks. When, having worked in the derivative market for years, the best way to learn is to lose money. And once people start going, oh, that was a bit dumb, I lost a lot of money, they won't do it again. Or if you keep protecting them, they don't learn. In terms of the banks themselves, they've also got problems. Originally, back when I was a kid, banks just lent money to industry, and building societies lent money to people getting a mortgage, buying a house. We had changed the rules in the 90s, and a lot of UK building societies converted themselves into banks, which gave them the ability to lend much more than they had in their vaults. A building society is a mutual, so they can only lend up to 100% of the deposit money they have, where a bank obviously has the ability to create money that isn't there, so they will lend out 10 times what they have in their deposits, or more, as happened in the 2008 financial crisis. But coming back to reality, without all of those building societies are now banks, and everyone's moved into a section of the market which is traditionally very, very safe. Most people repay their mortgages because your choice is you pay rent or you pay a mortgage. So the mortgages have the lowest chance of default. But also in the UK, and I suspect to a degree in Australia, we've had a massive deindustrialization has gone on in the UK over the last 20 years or 25 years, where we have had a lot of government regulation on industry, especially any industry that releases CO2 as an end product. So they've had to pay extra costs, and so it became much cheaper to import goods from China than to make them in the UK. I've just written a big paper about this. I'll do some advertising, but it's the deindustrialization of Britain, and it's pretty compelling. And when you look at that, you realize that banks who used to lend money to industries that had a lot of plant and equipment, now most industries in the UK are service industries. There may be some coffee chains with a lot of real estate, but generally you can set up a company on the internet today and spend virtually no money at all. And so banks don't have the customer base they used to have, so they moved into the mortgage market. And then I'd also like to agree with Martin. The reason interest rates are not controlling inflation the way they used to is because of our period of 10 to 12 years of ultra low interest rates. We drove up asset prices because suddenly anyone with any money could buy them. And so there's a whole generation of people who don't actually have a mortgage. So they don't really have to stop their spending the way my generation did. You know, controlling interest rates when I first came to the UK in the 80s was an amazing way to stop people spending, because we all had put every cent we had into some kind of mortgage. So when interest rates went up, and they were very high at the time, you had to stop spending because you didn't have any other money. Now people have huge numbers of credit cards and other ways of getting money, but also most of them don't have mortgages. So the spending portion of the population, the sort of under 40s, who they generally don't have mortgages.
Vicky, can I ask you the role of the Bank of International Settlements, the Bank of Central Banks? What should change?
Well, what we're seeing is that there has been a lot more regulation since the financial crisis, and quite a lot of, I mean, the BIS is very involved in assisting with that. Various countries have adopted some of those regulations in varying degrees. I mean, we know that the US is still perhaps not abiding by quite a lot of the rules that have been set under various Basel agreements, Basel 1, 2, now 3. But what we're finding is that certainly the financial system has been generally more secure. It's one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, sort of private credits come out. But I think it is important to bear in mind that right now what seems to be happening, pushed by the US, is a move towards deregulating. Certainly in the UK, but we're seeing some moves of that sort also possibly sort of beginning in the EU, but because of competition. Where will sort of the next financial centre be? And certainly from the UK's perspective, having left the EU, it needs to remain a main centre for financial operations, and the government has moved in to do all sorts of things to allow for that status to remain by deregulating in some areas. And that is a concern for many people, and certainly the BIS is having a good look at what everyone is doing across the world. But if we're talking earlier about what the central banks themselves are doing, of course they're regulating up to a point, but also they are quite concerned about growth, and in many cases they're being pushed by their governments to focus more on growth than anything else. That's going on in the US. In particular, with President Trump having been quite keen to see rates come down, even though for the moment the markets think they're going to be going up. And in that atmosphere of higher inflation, this is where we've got push for deregulation and also push for lower interest rates. This is why people are worried that what has been created is a financial bubble, particularly in the AI area, where a lot of money has been raised and invested in capital spending, which perhaps would be good for the economy overall at some point, but for the moment it's putting strain on everyone else. So I think we are in a position, well, at a point right now where we need to worry. And I think Catherine mentioned the issue of the change in the structure of the economy, and I think that is quite important. And you advertising my book, I see here, which talks precisely about that and how it's all changed, and that change in that structure has put extra risks to the economy. Over-reliance on the financial sector is a concern. So I think we are at a tipping point right now.
Martin, what do you think?
Well, I do think that we are at a critical point in history. And if you just look at it from a local perspective in Australia, and you look at the amount of household debt that is lurking out there, it's very, very high. It's not uniformly spread, and that's a point well made earlier on. There are some households who are doing it really well at the moment. They've got assets of various sorts. They're getting quite good returns on their term deposits and other investments. So there are some people doing well. But if you look at it very carefully, a lot of people, about half of people with mortgages in Australia, are struggling with cash flow. About 3/4 of people in the rental sector are struggling with cash flow. And in real income terms, they've gone backwards for years and years and years and years. From a banking perspective, it's interesting to see that more and more of lending is going to mortgages. 2/3 of bank lending in Australia is for mortgages. It used to be a third. Used to be 2/3 for business. It's now 1/3, and in fact, they're quite selective as to where they lend. So the banking system is actually re-amplifying and reinforcing this idea that safe investments in housing is the way to go. But of course, that's great for shareholders, low risk, but not necessarily good for the economy. And then the other point here, I need to come back to public debt. The public debt in Australia is extremely high. We're close to $1 trillion at the moment. And if you add in both the state and the federal debt, it's never been higher. That means that more of the amount of money that is taken out of taxpayers, and the tax take is as high as it's ever been in Australia, is actually going to pay the debt that the government is actually going through at the moment. Now, so we've got the situation where the government is throwing more money out there. They're talking about more support in the upcoming budget to try and protect households. And it seems to me that we've got the situation where we have an expectation now that governments will always save us from our own mistakes and everybody else's mistakes. And when you put all of this together, it's not surprising that the productivity is so low in around the world, in Australia in particular. If you look at just the amount that we're creating, our manufacturing has gone through the floor. The costs of energy are very, very high. Again, policy mistakes. And so you need to join the dots here. It's not just the financial system that's actually the problem at the moment. It's the broader policies coming from federal and state governments, and it's the structure of industries locally and internationally that are all converging. And I don't think the regulators, and I include the BIS internationally as well as the local regulators, because frankly it comes top down quite often, the regulators are up to speed with what they should be thinking about. They're over-regulating in some areas, they're completely under-regulating in other areas, and they're creating more contention ahead. Now, like I said in my previous comment, unless we change, this is going to get worse and worse. It's going to get harder and harder to get out of. We're very much in a cul-de-sac at the moment. And no, I don't think governments have the answer. I think they're just going to do the same old, same old. I think central banks will do the same old, because it's not in their interest necessarily to want to fix this, and that's the problem.
And Catherine McBride, your thoughts, please.
Well, it's interesting when Martin was talking about Australia, you could actually just cross out Australia and put Britain. I'm sure Vicky will agree. I don't think you said anything about Australia that isn't also the case in the UK, except our debt is higher. Our interest payments are something like 130 billion a year. So we're spending more on interest on our government debt than we spend on defence and education combined. And this is a crazy way to run a government. But in fairness to bank lending, if you ran around the country and asked sort of banks in various towns in the UK if anyone had even approached them to borrow money to build a factory in the last 20 years, I bet most of them would say no. They're only lending to the people that they can find. Our government has made it virtually impossible to do manufacturing in the UK. In the UK, we have the ability to produce a lot more oil and gas than we do, but we won't even give out new licenses. For some insane reason, we're importing oil and gas from Norway, which comes out of the same North Sea, but we don't want to import it from the UK. And this has a lot to do with the United Nations calculations of climate change, where emissions are only your territorial emissions. So if we burn oil and gas from Norway, that's their emissions, not our emissions. Where if we get it out of our own North Sea, that's our problem. So we don't do that. And these are things that our banks could be lending money for, big, new platforms in the North Sea. The UK doesn't even have a converter to turn gas into liquid natural gas. And that would be another massive investment if anyone wanted to build one here. But no one will, because our government keeps changing its mind on whether it wants to promote the North Sea or close it down. It saved the UK in the 1970s. It could save them again now. But they are really run by people who dropped science in primary school, and they really don't understand where energy comes from. Because even the UK's financial centre, which is its main industry, runs on electricity. We cannot afford to have blackouts in this country for 1 second. Every dealing room in London would be out, and everyone would move their trade to New York. And yet we have a government that thinks that it'll be okay to run on wind power. We'll all be fine, because someone will invent a battery that can keep going for 12 hours and run a dealing room. And that technology doesn't exist. We need oil and gas. We need to get it out of the ground. And yet, and that's something the banks could lend money for. But no one's even trying to do that. So, meanwhile, we're complaining we can't get enough liquid natural gas. We're complaining we don't have jet fuel. It's like, well, hello, where can we get jet fuel from? Let me think. We are run by a sort of insane government that has lost control of. They've lost reality. They just don't know where electricity comes from. They don't know the difference between energy and electricity. 80% of UK energy is from oil and gas. And yet, we've got this system where we're trying to pretend we don't use oil and gas. And we're okay to import it from Norway because that's somehow different. So sorry, I can rant and rant about this because I do see a lot of our problems, and they're extensive, and they're exactly as Vicky and Martin have said, but they could be, if not solved completely, reduced enormously, and no one's even going in that direction. They just want to keep doing more of the same because they're sure, even though it hasn't worked yet, it will surely work in the future,
I have to make a point here that I've done my research and I do know where electricity comes from. It comes from the wall, and I wish you would never even ask me that because it's obvious it comes from the wall. You plug it in and there it is. I have to ask you, first of all, ask Vicky this one. We're moving. Well, I could be a politician, Catherine.
You could be.
And you know what?
You passed the test. Yeah, that's all the test.
Well, even in Australia, we had this food crisis. The food insecurity at the moment because of the lack of fuel. Windmills don't work on trucks anyway. I'm sure most of the politicians think that you pour water on it and you have a leg of lamb waiting for you the next day in the supermarket. Yeah. Anyway, that's just me being quite rude, and I apologise to any politician out there. No, I don't. Vicky, I think we're moving in the wrong direction with digitalisation, CBDCs, and probably fewer retail banks. What's your thought on that?
Well, it's a real problem. I mean, if you walk down any high street in the UK, and I'm sure it's happening, I don't know what's going on exactly in Australia,
Not
you've
much.
seen the banks all disappearing. So in my high street, there were about 7 branches of banks. There is now only one, which is a new bank called Metro Bank, that is there. And even the postal help we were supposed to get, so post offices were meant to be doing it for us, sort of combining all those services the banks would give. Our main post office on the high street also closed, and after a lot of protests, we have one sort of in a side street, which is considerably smaller than before. And I think this is a problem. I think Catherine touched on that. Whether banks really understand what the customers want. So there was already a move. I have to confess that I worked for a bank for 10 years, but we did have services across the country. We had managers that understood the regions. So there were offices that were put in strategic places where they did the corporate lending decisions, 2 firms at the time. Now, of course, they've all been centralized, or at least to a very considerable extent. And that means that the knowledge, the local knowledge, what it is exactly that people may need their banks for has gone. There is now a move. In fact, there's been the odd bank, and I think it may have been Santander that says that we're going to start, or perhaps it was Barclays, I spoke wrongly. We're going to start increasing the number of branches again because they had overdone it. But once you lose that ability to understand what your customers want, I'm not surprised what Catherine was saying, that there isn't the lending that's required, particularly for SMEs that may indeed want to be in manufacturing. And the SMEs, in fact, tell you, because I'm very involved with our chambers of commerce here, that in fact, despite some easing in requirements for banks recently, they find it incredibly difficult to get any lending. Any borrowing themselves from the banks, because quite a lot of collateral that's being asked just kills the whole project entirely. You have, of course, the new investment maybe going into high-tech areas, and the government has put aside some money to assist on that alongside the banks. Well, maybe, but there is no doubt that on the manufacturing front, we are definitely lagging behind. And one small point about productivity that was also mentioned earlier. In fact, I think Martin mentioned that for Australia and elsewhere. I think the financial sector is in a way to blame, in the sense that we had all assumed, and as I said, I worked for the financial sector myself, that perhaps in terms of productivity, we didn't worry about the fact that there was a decline in the industrial production side, which I do talk about in my book, because after all, the financial sector, with paying such high salaries and making big returns, must be very productive, making up for the loss elsewhere. We saw with the financial crisis that simply wasn't sustainable, and getting back out of that conundrum is going to be very, very hard.
Martin, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think I want to take a slightly longer term view here and just think about what happened through the global financial crisis. And before that, we've had a series of big ups and big downs driven by the financial markets, which are very speculative instruments. And, a lot of people made a lot of money. A lot of banks particularly made a lot of money and then were never held accountable for their, meddling, frankly, in the financial system. And I think you've got to ask the question, over the recent years, what have we learned? We've learned that the financial system protects itself. The financial system is protected by the central banks, because if markets fall, they're suddenly going to support the old Fed put, the idea that the Fed will save the financial markets. We have got to the point where the nexus of success is measured in the financial sector and its ability to continue to grow stock prices. I mean, Trump keeps talking about, look at my stock prices, it's great. No. There needs to be a different definition of success, in my view, success at a societal level and success at an economic level. And if we don't do that, what we're going to find is that the financial system is going to expand and expand and expand. It's going to take over more and more of the economy. It sucks in the housing market, which is why house prices are so high and why people can't now afford to get into the housing sector. It also stops investment in other sectors because, of course, you know, the financial system risks can be managed and offset. And if you look at the oil price and the way that, funnily, people took short positions just before the announcement from the White House. Well, that gives you a little bit of clue, right? There are people out there making massive profits out of the financial system and playing the financial system. But here's the point. The financial system should be and needs to be supporting real businesses and real households. It needs to be enabling an investment in things that will actually protect for the future. Now, here's the point. Central banks have a mandate about inflation, but they also need to have a mandate about sustainable economic momentum, it seems to me. And if they were to actually start providing finance, perhaps directly into big projects like Commonwealth Bank did years ago in Australia, you know, they were intrinsically connected with building lots of homes and building lots of industry. That was a very successful period when the Commonwealth Bank was actually a public bank. Well, central banks or a public bank, they have a lever there they could use. They have another lever too. In Australia, there's legislation that says the Reserve Bank can direct lending to different parts of the economy if they so choose. At the moment, they sit there and just let the economy battle it out and let the financial system battle it out. And guess who are the winners? Well, the housing sector and the builders and everything else. Look, the Reserve Bank has other levers. And one of the big myths here is the so-called lack of power that central banks have. Michelle Bullock said, "Oh, I've only got interest rates. That's the only lever I can pull. It's not a blunt lever at all. It's going to be pretty bad." Look, there are things they could do if they had a better mandate. The mandate they've got at the moment is nuts. It's about protecting the status quo and the financial system rather than the real economy. We have to change it.
Catherine McBride, OBE, you can't forget that bit. Sorry about that. The future for ordinary people, just the normal people, the normies, can it be getting better?
Well, in defence of sort of the banking industry, we have had a few new banks have appeared in the UK. I was interested to hear what Vicky was saying about Barclays reopening branches, because I've gone from a place in central London where I could walk to 7 bank branches when I bought this house 20 years ago, and now there's none, not one. There's an ATM in a supermarket, and that's it. If you need cash, forget it. And we've got new banks have opened up that are entirely virtual, if you like. And a lot of young people I know have those cards. They have banks from cards. And there's a lot easier to travel. Almost all the Australian friends I have, when they come over here, they've all got cards that have got money in different currencies on it, which is much cheaper than the bank rates that they used to charge. So I think that there has been a lot of improvement in banks, but at the same time, I'm going to agree with Vicky on. I've just set up a new think tank, and it's it's a company. We set it up as a company rather than a charity, because the charity laws in the UK are just outrageous. But the setting up a company is almost as difficult. It took months to get a bank account, even from a bank that the major financiers already bank with. And they are so terrified of getting things wrong. But all of the forms, it's all computer says no sort of thing. The forms are the same all around the country. So the idea of your local bank manager knowing who you are and whether your business will do well in that area, because he knows the potential for the demand for your product, he knows the potential for you to find employees, he knows sort of everything about the area because he banks for the area. And now we've got this system where it's all centralized, everyone fills in the same form, the form goes to a central office, and the computer says no. And if you tick the wrong box, or if you say that you're doing something that they're not sure about, then you're back to the beginning again, and you have to refill in the form and change the box ticking. And that has put banks under shall we say, a sort of, it's very difficult to banks to actually make sound investments that way. Though I know we're in every other industry moving into AI, there are some times when I think human has a better judgment of where banks should spend money. However, I'll now switch to what Martin is suggesting. And when I went to primary school in Sydney, I had a rural bank account, I think. It was before the Commonwealth Bank. Maybe it was a Commonwealth Bank. And they used to come to the school every Wednesday, and all the kids would bring their pocket money in and put their 20 cents into their bank account. And you had a bank book so you could see the money growing. And that was actually probably a really good way to teach children about banking, but also they probably had a million accounts from everyone in the country had one of these bank books, or every child. But whether governments are better at picking what needs to be built is interesting, because the UK used to have a lot of council houses and houses but they were built by the local councils rather than the central government. And I have a feeling that the local council probably has a better angle on where the housing is. But in a lot of places, because we've had a concentration of industry in the UK, where so much is centred around London and the southeast, that it's hard to find land that you can build on. And we have restrictions about expanding London, and most of the towns probably have similar restrictions, or they're surrounded by farmland or land that is zoned for non-housing. And so, though it sounds like a good idea that a central government or a government bank should be lending money for housing or lending money to do various things, and I would agree with that idea. They've actually tried that in the past, and it always didn't work very well, because being a bank manager, I believe, and though I worked in banks like Vicky for years, I worked in the investment banking rather than lending money banking. But I'm sure that that's a real skill that people are good at. And I think if anyone working for the government had that kind of skill, they'd be working in a bank, because they'd make more money. And I suspect that governments probably aren't as good as it. They probably think they are. They probably go, oh, that looks easy, I could do that. But I think when most of them are there, they discover that that is not as easy as it looks. And I know I interviewed quite a few banks when I was working at the IEA. I was writing papers about financial regulation. And I interviewed some of the people who were running these new banks that were setting up. And a lot of them were taking staff from established organizations, like, say, American Express, because they were great at managing credit risk. And so they knew that they needed to have skills that they could steal from existing finance companies or existing banks or credit card companies or whatever. So I think it all sounds good, but I'm not sure that it's as doable in practice, mainly because our government doesn't have the skills. I mean, we've just set up a thing called GB Energy, and the UK has a lot of oil and gas reserves on land that have not been tapped. And I'm not just talking about fracking. We have gas wells in Lincolnshire that we could be exploiting. And like Norway's government has invested in wells. So they actually, when someone wants to open up a new license, the government will take a piece of the action. They will invest in that, and take 20% of the development or something. Now, GB Energy could be doing that with our oil and gas, but instead they're investing in completely untried carbon capture machines. And while I understand that the only person who's ever going to invest in completely untried stuff is going to be the government, but if they just put some of the money into something that they know has a real return, that would be a great investment. But they're not even thinking about it. So they're just going all for the pie in the sky stuff, which is fine. That someone has to finance that. And if it works, it's brilliant. But if it doesn't work, it's taxpayers who pay the bill. So they could hedge themselves by investing in existing technology that we know works, and yet they're not actually doing that. So I don't think they have banking skills, because from my experience in banking, it was all about hedging, and I don't think our government really understands that.
A bit like ideology v reality, and I probably think reality at this stage is what we need, and a good foot up the backside to bring you into that real world, as my father would once say. Richard Werner makes an argument that prosperity is quite achievable, but you need a different banking structure and system. More small regional banks lending to small businesses. Vicky.
Yes, well, I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is we need to look at how small regional banks are regulated. And we've seen in the US a number of small-ish regional banks really doing rather badly. So you have to be very careful as to how those banks are run, because they can have substantial repercussions for the regional economy where they're involved. But there is a point, as we were saying earlier, understanding what's going on around you and not perhaps just following what maybe an algorithm will tell you whether you should lend or not is really important. But in terms of how governments can be involved, I mean, in the UK, there's been now the creation, well, for some time, of a British business bank, which is lending a certain amount of money in addition to other organizations also being involved. So they're sort of, in many ways, sort of pump priming whatever may be needed. There is now even very late, not like Norway and others, but very, very late, unfortunately, and very small, a UK sovereign wealth or UK wealth fund, which the government is making available for some of investments. There is an industrial strategy, so the government is trying to de-risk some of the money that may be going in. We've seen that recently also in terms of supporting both the pharmaceutical industry, but also car production in the UK. So there is a certain amount of that the governments are involved in, but more in terms of encouraging other institutions to come in. But going back to the regional issue, I'm a real great believer in that. And I have seen how that change that we've seen in terms of centralization has been, pretty bad for particular sectors in the economy. And it's one of the reasons also why we've seen, as I say in my book, this mismanaged decline taking place and needs to be rethought.
Yep, I totally agree with you. Martin North, Richard Werner says more small regional banks lending to small businesses. What do you think?
Well, small businesses, I survey small businesses as part of my work in the UK and in Australia. Small businesses can't get the financial support from the financial system that they need to grow. They have to jump through huge amounts of hoops. They have often to put their house up before they get anything at all. And in fact, if you talk to some of the bankers, they will prefer to lend to the big guys because, well, it's a small number of transactions and they can focus on those rather than the larger ones. So there's a real question about how do small businesses thrive and survive in this environment. In Germany, of course, you do have a pantheon of smaller local banks, and I would argue that the financial system in Germany is structured quite differently and it's working much better. So I think there's an opportunity there. And yeah, sure, you can do a lot of it digitally, but I also agree with the commentary as well. That local knowledge of a business is critical. My father was a bank manager, and he spent his whole life sitting down with customers and businesses, learning their business and helping them and advising them and steering them into the right future direction. That's not an AI. An AI can't do that. It's about experience and knowledge and helping people who are not necessarily expert at their financial management of their business, but expert at what they do with the help that they need. That is missing for most small businesses, both in Australia and in the UK and around the world. So I'm in favor of this idea of facilitating, that local engagement with the community, with businesses, community banks, all of those things. It's got to be part of the story. I also would make the point, there's some recent work being done about showing that when you actually take cash out of the system and when you close branches, you strangle local communities. And in fact, a couple of years ago, there was some work done in Australia looking at the effect of branch closures. The branches said, these banks are unprofitable and we can't afford to keep them open. It's too expensive to move cash around. And they tried to sort of confect some arguments. But actually, when you look at it closely, when the branch goes, the community goes. especially in digitally deprived areas, as in regional Australia, where you can't use the digital systems to be able to actually do your banking. So people have been traveling huge amounts of distances now just to handle and deposit cash. And interestingly, there was a recent couple of Tuesdays ago, there was a cash out day where people were actually encouraged to go and pull cash out of the ATMs, the dwindling number of ATMs in Australia. Well, it was very successful. More people are using cash. Youngsters are using cash as part of controlling their finances and learning about finances, and actually more direct exposure to how money works is a really important thing, because I actually have this theory, had it for some time, that when you're a youngster and you just see your parents waggle a card and magically you get something, you've got no understanding of what the value of money is. If you give them real money and say, well, you got to earn this to do this to be able to spend it, and if you go overdrawn, you can't do that. So I think there's a real financial education issue as well as part of this. We've got to help individuals and businesses know more about how money works and how to actually get to familiar with it. Get cash back and working, because I actually think cash has to be part of the solution to the future, not least because when the power goes off, when our digital ID gets stolen, at least we can still use cash to get around. And you saw what happened for the floods and fires recently. People couldn't actually just get by at all. So again, it comes back to, we've got to question some of the fundamental assumptions that have been pushed at us for a long, long time. Banks have said, oh no, cash is disappearing, it's no longer important. Rubbish. Small businesses aren't important. No, they are hugely important. The banking system is not supporting them. The central bank is not doing what they should be doing. They are fixated on this little interest rate conundrum, which they'll never get. They'll never win because it's impossible. And finally, very importantly, we need to separate the speculative banking, the trade banking, from the day-to-day lending to businesses and to households, and to understand that those two things are not the same, and yet they're all mashed in together. And if you look at the recent results rounds, it's the speculative investment banking where all the money's made. Well, that's something wrong there too.
Interesting too, you mentioned the banks, when they disappear, they actually create havoc with local communities. I think it's Cooper Pedy in South Australia, which I suggest you all should go there for the sins you haven't committed or you are about to commit, because it's a very hot part of Australia. But they do a great job there, and they work very hard. But they have to drive, I think, 2.5 to 3 hours now to get to a bank. Community still is together. However, it is placing great strain, as with other rural and outback areas throughout the entirety of Australia. And even
just a quick point on that. I actually worked with the Cooper Pedy local community when we were trying to stop the last branch closing. Right, and what was so interesting about that was the local community was absolutely distraught, because they could see that this was going to fundamentally mess up their local economy. The bank didn't care. Then they said, oh, you can go to the local Australia Post, except that Australia Post had very severe limitations on what they can actually do. And the banks keep saying, oh, AP will solve the problem. No, it won't. The banks have walked away from so many communities across Australia. Shame on them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also the new fear is that because bad mobile reception there, the phones don't work, I think about an hour and a half out of it. There's this black spot for about an hour. They are carrying large amounts of money at times because of the business they've been doing. And to go from point A to point B, which is, as I said, 2.5, 3 hours away, they are fearful that they could be robbed. But it's not the bank's concern, is it, Catherine? The bank's just there to make money, or is it? It shouldn't be there as a reminder that a community is more important than that bottom line.
Well, this comes back to the government bank, because banks are there to make money. They are private companies. They are only lending you money because they're making money from doing so. So it's this idea that they should be offering a public service is when you suddenly go, well, in the same way that someone's got to take the phone lines and the electricity to isolated communities in Australia and in Britain. You'll have people in the Scottish Highland Islands off the Hebrides or somewhere that need to get services as well as the mainland. And this is always a problem for any industry that's trying to provide a service around the country, that it's everyone wants to be where the bulk of the people are, and where the wealth is, and no one's so interested in going to more difficult terrain. It surprises me because I have been to Cooper Pedy, not for my sins, but and I've driven across all of that. I actually didn't see any black spots on mobile services. I was incredibly impressed at that. But it's got a really big industry, the opal mining there. So it intrigues me that there aren't banks there, because there must be quite a lot of money associated with that. But just coming back to the original idea about the local banks versus large banks, all of these countries you're talking about have very different banking systems. In the US, for years, banks were operated by the states. So banks couldn't actually go into other states and set up branches. That's all changed a bit now because there's been a lot of consolidation in the US. But you still find that the regulation is a state regulation, all banking regulation, as in insurance regulation is as well. And so the banks, like even names that you would know, Citibank or Bank One or Wells Fargo, they were all actually state banks. They weren't international just because we knew their name internationally. And the German system is quite similar, and Germany, companies go to banks to get money. There's a big sort of history and tradition of doing that. They're much more likely to get money from their local bank than they are to ever float on a stock market. So the UK has always had a system, and it's this Australian system because of the heritage there, that companies would raise money on a stock market, so they would float part of their equity onto the stock market. And while that works for a large company, it's very hard for a brand new company to raise money on a stock market. So you do need seed capital. Now there are a lot of other ways of getting seed capital, especially in London, and that does not involve the banks. But that comes back to the beginning of this conversation, where I think it was Martin, but it might have been Vicky, who brought up the whole shadow banking, because there are a lot of various funds that are providing seed capital to new entrepreneurs, and it's whether they are regulated as well as they should be is another issue. But a lot of them work by word of mouth, and so they're in the old days when I started in London, your word was your bond, and huge amounts of money were traded over a telephone call, and you had to be good for that, otherwise you'd never work in London again. And that is sort of what's happening online with these sort of funds that raise money for seed capital, where people see them online, and if there's a problem with them, they'll be sort of pile up, an online pile-on will go on, and they'll be out of business very quickly. So there is a sort of way of policing it, if you like, that doesn't involve a regulator. Is it just that they rely on investors going, this is a good idea, you should go into it. So they need that word of mouth. But yeah, to convert an Australian or a British system into an American system is very difficult. We don't even though in UK it's technically 4 countries and there's a lot of devolved things, finance is not devolved. So everyone has the same banks and the same banking rules and regulations. And Germany, and I'm going to say Austria probably as well, they've always had a system where a local company gets bank financing, even when it's a massive multinational. They will still be very heavily connected to their local banks and even their local their local government. So if you look at the shareholdings of something like VW, the law Audi, the local whatever they're called, municipality in Germany, that state, has a large proportion of the shareholding in the company. So it's sort of still family owned. You'll find a lot of families own a large amount of these companies. The local authority will own a large amount of the company, and then a bank will have massive loans to it. So we just have a very different way of raising money, and almost all large companies in the UK are listed on the stock market, and it's just what we've always done.
You made a good point there, or you made a point, I don't agree with it, that they have to make money. Banks, I think they also have a social responsibility because...
Well, that would be the Commonwealth Bank. I mean, why did we let the Commonwealth Bank become yet another commercial bank when we already had commercial banks? It was a strange, because a lot of countries do have a government bank, and the government bank should be picking up the tab because they don't have shareholders, they don't have to appease their shareholders. They can go and provide banking services to an isolated community. Though I'm really intrigued that it's not worth any bank's while to be in Cooper Pedy, because not only do you have the mining industry, but you have a lot of tourists. I was there as a tourist. I've stayed in the hotels under the ground. They're nice and cool. They're very dark at night, very quiet. Good place if you're having trouble sleeping to head out to Cooper Pedy for a week. But so I'm intrigued that the banks aren't there, but at the same time, I don't think it's their job to be there. They're not a public service. They are private companies.
We have gone way over time, but I need to ask you just, by the way, this is just a fantastic conversation and I appreciate it to all of you. Can you just tell me, Vicky, your thoughts on the future of banking? How will it look different? Just say, well, look into your cup of tea, because it's the morning, the G&T can wait till later, 5 p.m, please. Look into your cup of tea and tell me how the banking system, globally and locally, will be different than what it is now, or will it be different?
Well, I think what is happening is we're moving rapidly towards digitalization more generally. So loads of bodies in different countries are talking about digital currencies, of course. So even a digital euro. We have stable coins developing. I mean, there is a real issue about whether the banks will still be there in the future as intermediaries. Once you start having a lot more digital transactions and also governments actually supporting a digital pound, a digital euro, so you have your account and you pass completely the intermediaries and you do your transactions straight with each other, then you wonder what the banks will be there for. And what they really should be there for is to do all this lending. So there is a real issue that on the one hand, one is moving to easing transactions and costs by governments and regulators. And on the other, what you may be doing is just killing this financial intermediation, which also is the way in which banks are able to, if you like, live on the deposits that people are making with them and then lend on to businesses. So we've got to watch this quite carefully. Yes, of course, as Catherine is saying, quite a lot of money is being made by investment banks, mainly because of trading, not necessarily speculating, but certainly the trading volatility we've seen has increased profits very significantly for all those financial institutions involved in buying and selling stocks or anything at all, derivatives of any sort. But it's the retail banks that we need to be worrying about, the ones that really are the ones that give you possibly and hopefully the cash that you need for an economy to grow. And those, I think, are going to be under threat.
Martin North, you know what I think about banks. I think they have a responsibility, regardless of what Catherine believes. I think they do have a responsibility to communities, and it is decimating the Australian bush and other outback areas throughout Australia. However, how do you see the banking industry within the next 5 years? Will it remain the same look, or will it change?
I think at the moment we're going to get bigger building societies. In other words, the banks will lend more and more to housing because that's easy, cheap money. The BIS rules allow them to actually leverage up dramatically. Nothing is going to change unless households and communities start calling for change. And that's one of the things I think that we need to highlight here. There are things that could be done differently. We could have a different role for a central bank. We could have a different role for the community banks and for the commercial banks. But if we just all accept, this is just the digitalization is going to continue and there's nothing we can do about it, and they will continue to milk us, I do believe that banks have a social license, which means they have a social responsibility. They always have. It's just that now the politicians tend to sort of go on the side of the bankers rather than the side of ordinary people. So it seems to me that there is a really critical question about what is the future of banking. Also make the other point, central bank digital currency, it's still there, it's still being tested. Central banks, of course, will love that because that gives them more control, another set of levers, as Jerome Powell once said, to be able to actually implement monetary policy. Well, they've done that really well, haven't they? No, they haven't. So we shouldn't allow that to happen without much more clarity about why and what you would want to do with it. And then the final point is you can't just put the responsibility here on the banks and the banking system, right? There is a severe connection between the banking system, the politicians, and the way things are done in the large corporations. All of that stuff is biased against the interests of ordinary households and ordinary businesses. We have to break that nexus if we're actually to change. If we do change, we could have a very different banking system, focus more on providing the support that's required for ordinary businesses and ordinary households, and maybe even see house prices come down a bit, which would be quite good as well.
Catherine, you have the final say.
Okay, well, I'll give Martin, if you're going to go down this line, you should basically be saying that because banks have fractional reserve ability, because the government has allowed them to lend more than they have in deposits, that is a responsibility, that with that should come a responsibility to provide services everywhere in Australia. And maybe that's the pull the government could have over the banks and say, well, if you don't lend money everywhere, we're not going to let you have the same fractional reserve banking. In fact, for every place that you knock off, we'll take down how much you can lend. So they could actually do that. And that is a reason why banks are maybe not private companies, because they do have an ability to lend money that they don't have. And that is given to them by the government. And so that is a reason why they should provide services everywhere. So I'll give you that, and I will say, well, that's why they are slightly different than your regular private company. But at the same time, I think Vicky has brought up a brilliant point that we should have probably started with, and we're going to have to do this whole conversation again, and just talk about where crypto leaves banks, because you could cut out the middleman completely. You know, you could find that the Federal Reserve does all the lending, provides all the services. It does require reliable electricity. You can't run crypto on wind power and solar power. You need to have real electricity run on gas or coal. But if you've got that, you know, crypto could wipe out the whole banking industry very quickly if the banks, the central banks, decide to do that. So it's a future conversation because it's much more complicated. And besides the central bank currencies, you've obviously got the Bitcoins and the Ethereums and the thousands of small ones that come and go that none of us sort of know about, but they're out there. And that's both a headache for the banks, the central banks, because it allows people to move money around the world without them having any control over it or preventing it, which is what I think they'd want to do. But at the same time, it would allow them to take back control of the whole banking industry, which would be interesting. could wipe them all out completely if they wanted to. Yeah. So another day. It's a long conversation.
And we do need to have, so I'm going to round you up. We'll get Jen will be calling soon and sending off emails, because I think we've only just touched the tip of this iceberg, and I think your knowledge, all three, is just second to none. So again, we appreciate it very much. Vicky, if somebody wants to find out how to grab a good book or find out more about you, how do they do that?
Well, they can look up Mismanaged Decline, or they can look me up, and this is my latest book about the UK mostly, but of course it talks more generally as well, and gives some ideas of where we might be going next. So Amazon, Biteback, the publishers, it's all available there. But thank you for allowing me to, or giving this plug to my book. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, we can't pay you, so we have to just somehow work something out. And Martin
Well,
North, I probably owe you about 4 bottles of scotch, but that'll have to wait till I'm in the UK next. Martin North, if somebody wants to find out more about you, how do they do that?
So I've got digitalfinanceanalytics.com, which is my blog and website, and also my YouTube channel called Walk the World. I make daily posts on finance and property and related issues, including central banks and all of those things. So look me up there.
And a beautiful part of the world, Bath. In fact, it's one of my, I have to say, one of my favourite parts of the world. A magnificent part of the world too. So I envy you, and they have some great restaurants there too. And it's bigger than you think it is too, because we decided, my wife and I, to go for a walk around Bath. It's a long way. It's a very long way.
And very hilly.
Yes, and those cobblestone streets, they're not good for slippery shoes, let me tell you. And Catherine McBride, who's been everywhere, including Cooper Pedy. Catherine McBride, OBE, if somebody wants to find out more about you and get in contact, how do they do that?
Well, I write a weekly Substack, or at least I try to, and I've recently become the CEO of a new think tank called the Great British Business Council, and our first paper was published in April, and it is called the Premeditated Industrial Destruction, and it's sort of a history of how the UK basically got rid of all of its industry, and why its banking industry now only can lend money to housing, because we pretty much closed down the rest and imported goods from China and gave ourselves a gold star for cutting our carbon emissions, which is unbelievable story, and it traces how this happened and how we get out of it, because we have tied ourselves up in a lot of regulation. It's a very complicated spider's web.
It is indeed. Vicky Price, Martin North and Catherine McBride, OBE, thank you so much for being our guest on the Protagonist today, or tonight, it depends where you are, on The World Today. More tomorrow, no idea what it is, but I can't wait anyway. Be kind to your friends, be kind to your neighbours, and also be kind to yourself, because if you're not kind to yourself, nobody else will probably. Have a great night tonight. I'm off home now to investigate the Scottish medicine. And apparently I'll have a couple of those just to make sure I don't get COVID. Maybe not. Take care, be careful, and thank you so much for joining us on The Protagonists.